Okay, now I want to welcome Andrew Koutnik. Andrew's a friend. He's been an academic partner to us. He's been a really tremendous thought leader in the space of metabolic health and has helped us and led a couple of research initiatives, including the Grove City studies on high versus low carb diets versus performance. On the major IRB initiative, that is our current general population study, Andrew was one of the first people that I worked with to try to shape that. Was really influential in our thinking around what that study should look like and helping us get to a point where we could actually get that over the finish line, which has obviously been huge for our company. Research scientist, sits right at the inflection point of nutrition, metabolism, personal interest and performance. There's just a ton going on. Andrew, I appreciate you taking some time to chat with us. And first of all, would love to hear a few words about your excitement about the future of metabolic health and metabolic health technology. And then I would love to hear a little bit more from you on the recent study results that we got with you and your team.
I appreciate that intro, Josh. Can you guys all hear me okay? I'll thumbs up, I assume. All right, good deal. Well, honored to be here, guys. It's cool. Known of Levels for quite a long period of time. You guys have really been in the forefront of the CGM glycemic world from a business perspective for quite a while. So I appreciate being here, knowing Josh and working with Asher for quite a bit of time here to try and convert some of the help you guys have brought to our research world. For your first question, Josh, what is my thought on the future of metabolic health? Well, I'm obviously very biased. I mean, I live with diabetes, right? You know, I take injections every day, syringes, you know, I wear a CGM for over a decade. So I'm going to give you a biased response to that, but I think the insights that those can glean people is amazing. If they're able to do it, I think what they can learn from it, if they have good information, informative information, could quite frankly transform some people's lives. And I think we see that the data supports that these tools can move the meter, can move the needle, so to speak, in someone's health. If they use it the right way, they use the right information and they can capitalize on that opportunity. From a research perspective, this is kind of the bridge over to what we did. I think there's limitless opportunities. I think it's really been around for quite a period of time of what it can do beyond the world of diabetes, which I come from and have lived personally with type 1. But I think its ability to translate into other aspects, such as sport, such as the ability to track informative biomarkers for not just things like performance, which is what we analyze in the sports context, but well beyond that, where I think the future lies, which is health. And so that kind of leads into our study, that one of a few that we've done, and Levels has been a huge supporter of these initiatives by providing sensors and other support to make sure these studies actually happen. They don't happen otherwise, as you guys probably are aware of. But one of the biggest studies we did, I guess big from the perspective of what it actually meant for the world of sports, what it meant for the world of performance, what it meant for the world of metabolic health, is a recent study we did in 10 middle-aged competitive athletes. The reason for choosing middle-aged athletes is particularly important. Middle-aged athletes is kind of at that crossroads between young and healthy and aged community, where we know there's these subclinical changes that seem to occur before we see overt diagnosis of things like very common diseases like diabetes, obesity, et cetera. Those are obviously part of the metabolic disease suite. And we were interested in this community specifically because of that reason, and tracking glycemia for that reason. We see in the data, if you look at general observational epidemiologic data, that if you look at general population trends and things like fasting blood glucose, now not all data is super consistent, and we obviously need a lot more on that specifically, and what's happening in the CGM world, or what's happening when people wear CGMs in general, to understand what that data looks like outside of things like diabetes, because that's where most of the data sits right now. But we were interested in this glycemic perspective, but the study really originated on performance, the idea of sports performance. Could we give a low carbohydrate diet or a high carbohydrate diet, this kind of typical dietary paradigm of high carb versus this kind of counterintuitive or reverse logic low carb, which has been particularly popular over the last 5 years. And the reason we were interested in doing that is because of a lot of literature that if you do that for less than 4 weeks, that there might be a drop off in performance, particularly in elite athletes. We were interested to look at very, very highly competitive athletes from a perspective of performance. So we not just performance, it's worth clarifying the short duration, high intensity performance. That's highly relevant because those typically utilize glycolytic metabolites to fuel the performance initiatives. So when these individuals underwent 4 weeks of a very low carbohydrate diet versus a high carbohydrate diet, these individuals performed exactly the same, meaning that someone, if they at least habituated to a diet for 4 weeks, these two very contrasting forms of dietary intake, high carb and low carb, especially important to highlight that low carb is a profound shift in your metabolism. It essentially overhauls the type of metabolites you're using, not just at rest, but also throughout performance initiatives. When these individuals were performing, they performed exactly the same. But what was uniquely different is what was fueling that performance. The individuals on the low carbohydrate group were actually achieving record levels of fat oxidation. So they were utilizing during exercise at high levels of fat, over 1.5 grams per minute during very, very high intense exercise bouts. That's even more important to highlight that was over 85% of someone's VO2 max. Typically, when you consider this crossover effect, if anyone's familiar with that, as you get farther and farther down the spectrum of higher intensities, up to 100% VO2 max, carbohydrate oxidation goes up, fat oxidation goes down. What we saw is that people were able to oxidize record levels of fat even beyond where it should have normally been shut down. So that was over 85% of their VO2 max. So no one's really ever reported that at these levels before, hence the point of doing these very high intense short duration exercise bout. And again, they did that and performed the same. But the thing that really was near and dear to my heart as someone living with type 1 diabetes was the metabolic or cardiometabolic health effect of this dietary shift from a glycemic health vantage point. And we saw very typical trends in low carbohydrate cardiometabolic effects. You would expect things like HbA1c to start showing trends for decreases, insulin to come down just slightly, but things like total cholesterol might rise, LDL might rise, HDL might rise as well, and triglycerides might come down. And we saw all those typical effects very consistent with the literature. What was very stark and very important to me, but completely unexpected, is when tracking glycemic response, there was a run-in period for both groups. And this was a crossover study, which meant that the individuals were actually the same individuals across high carb and a washout period, and then did low carb and in a randomized order. We controlled body weight changes as much as we could. We controlled calorie intake, and we controlled activity level. So what we are really trying to elucidate here is diet-induced effects on performance, substrate oxidation, and glycemic and cardiometabolic health. So I already talked about a lot of that, but from a glycemic health perspective, there was a distinct difference between those in the high carb group and the low carb group, meaning that those in the high carb group ran higher on average, had greater deviation than those in the low carb group. Now, someone may ask, so what? Okay, someone who's on a high carb diet, they're supposed to see these trends during the prandial period, so when they're awake and when they're eating. The problem is that in 30% of these middle-aged, highly competitive athletes, 30% had glycemic values, not only in the 24-hour window, but in the fasting period as well, over a 31-day period, consistent with pre-diabetes, which meant that if you actually monitor someone using these advanced tools that don't just track a single biomarker at one single snapshot, but you looked at minute-by-minute data over multiple days, you started to see or elucidate values consistent with adverse responses in glycemia or dysglycemia. And that meant that 3 of the individuals in this community was actually north of 100 milligrams per deciliter over a 24-hour period and during their fasted window, but actually all 3 of them were above 110 milligrams per deciliter. Someone could say, okay, that's just a caveat of the measurement tool. You didn't look at HbA1c or oral glucose tolerance test, but we had batch control. They were crossover analysis. They were using the same spot. We really tried to eliminate the possibility that was an effect here. And still on the high carbohydrate diet, 30% had dysglycemia values consistent with prediabetes according to the American Diabetes Association and consistent with other studies. When doing a low carbohydrate diet, all individuals reversed that and lowered their glucose values into normal glycemic range. This illustrated to me as a take home that the initial point of the primary outcome was performance, and they performed exactly the same. They had remarked shifts in substrate oxidation to fuel that shift in dietary paradigm. So what you fed them is what they were oxidizing during exercise. But what was stark, very different and unexpected was this dysglycemia in a percentage of the subjects, which we don't completely understand. And we would not have elucidated if we weren't using these refined tools such as CGM to try and track them. as such, I think it opens a can of worms in the athletic community, this idea of whether we should be following these standard paradigms, or maybe we should rethink the way people are fueling their exercise and efforts, because it's not just about performance. It's not just about elite athletes and what they're doing. Frankly, 99% of the population will never be elite. So we're talking about the 99% of the rest of the community in regards to their metabolic health. So that's really the take home. That's the enthusiasm that I have towards this topic, because I think it opens a can of worms that even the most healthy, those who are exercising, the most protected, lean, normal body weight, et cetera, show signs that we should be maybe reconsidering what they're doing if they're performing exactly the same from a nutritional perspective, and how it impacts ultimately glycemia. So I'll stop there and say I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you guys.
Well, that was an awesome and packed refresher. I think, luckily we have this on recording so people can go back and review the takeaways. But yeah, I mean, I think you nailed all the points that I'm super excited we were able to uncover with that research. That, the objective was to show interesting new findings and to challenge some of the assumptions. And as somebody myself who was surprised at how bad my glycemic control was on a 24-hour CGM trace when I first tried it, despite having none of the classic, aesthetic markers that I should be worried. It definitely resonates with me, and I'm really curious to continue to drive in and see why is this happening, especially for people that don't have, don't carry the classic signs. I also think it's really important to remind ourselves that most of the nutrition industry, especially around sports and athletics, the assumption is made that whatever the elite athletes are doing, I should do if I'm just a weekend warrior. If I'm somebody that hits the gym an hour a night, well, let me fuel up on Gatorade and let me make sure that I'm carb loading and glycogen replenishing and all of those classic techniques. That does not scale, and it might not even work for that elite person either. So anyway, Andrew, there's a ton more here that we could dig into. I would love to obviously turn this into a long podcast going deep down the rabbit hole. So maybe we'll have to just do that sometime soon. But for the rest of the team, definitely check out the study. I dropped it in the results there. Really excited that we were able to work with Andrew and the rest of the team. And Andrew, if there's one other thing, maybe it's rather than asking what we should improve on the Levels product, I think let's instead focus on what is the next major discovery or exploration or study that you believe should happen in order to push the field forward.
Okay, so and I think this is actually particularly timely. If anyone follows Twitter, you've probably seen an absolute explosion happen around postprandial response, the impact that might have or not have. I want to highlight one thing. There is relevance to that discussion. The problem is that there's a lot of assumptions made around preliminary data outside of the CGM world. That to push things forward, the next big step, in my opinion, that is universally acknowledged across all the individuals who are a part of that discussion, whether on the side of it shouldn't matter, these postprandial responses don't matter, or they do matter a lot, or to some spectrum of how they do matter, is understanding what is happening in the non-diabetic population using these CGMs, i.e. what the bigger initiative was that Josh elucidated earlier. I am keen on that because there's a huge amount of assumptions made around these glycemic responses, yet we don't really know what's happening across the mean of the general population. I think Levels has a unique opportunity to take advantage of that and do something about it to open the eyes of the rest of the world as to what is actually going on and how does that set the reference point for everything else that people are speculating on at this point. Because a lot of those discussions that you guys are seeing are based on speculation and usually trying to temper concern. In our study, someone seeing a 24-hour and fasting glycemic response over 110 milligrams per deciliter, I don't think is a sign we should just assume that's normal. I take the opposite response in that regard. So especially since we know that between healthy and older and aged communities, there are things that are happening well before overt diagnosis. And I think that we might be seeing some indications that there's something we should be looking at and understanding at a greater level. And understanding CGMs from the general normative population is the biggest, most impactful step that can be made in understanding and moving that research forward.
Love it. Yeah, we're taking steps towards that, of course, but lots more to do to show something conclusive. Andrew, thanks a lot for taking the time and jamming with us and working with us. Lots more I'm sure we'll do together. So if you want to stick around for the rest of the meeting, we've got a packed one and would love to have you hang. If not, thanks from the whole team. Really appreciate it.
Appreciate you guys. I will just stick around until you guys finish. So
awesome.